Strictly speaking, this is an impossible subject because the mantra, by definition, cannot be spoken of. Nothing can be said about it. It cannot be analyzed because the mantra begins where analysis ends. Nevertheless, I hope that by the end of this talk you will have a better idea about how to read Savitri so that the effect of the mantra is more complete. Because the aspect of the mantra that I'm going to dwell on most is the aspect of sound. And to fully appreciate the use of sound in the mantra, one has to understand certain things about the meter and rhythm of the mantra, in this case the mantra of Savitri, which is English poetry, although the concept of the mantra comes from the Veda. Sri Aurobindo took the Vedic conception of the mantra, as we will see, and extended it to poetry in general when it's raised to its highest possibilities, including modern English poetry, which he wrote on a massive scale in Savitri. So, because of the difficulty of defining the mantra, I'm going to start with a passage from Savitri itself, which I think gives the best description both of the process by which the mantra is received by the poet and the meaning of the mantra, what the mantra is. This passage occurs in Book 4, Canto 4 of Savitri, The Quest, where Savitri is traveling across ancient India and she passes through the ashrams of the sages. These seem to be the sages of the Vedic period, and what is described here is the process by which the rishis received the mantras of the Veda. But it also very clearly describes Sri Aurobindo's own experience of writing poetry, and in particular Savitri. So this is just 7 lines, but it gives a very good introduction to what Sri Aurobindo means by the mantra, and in particular, as we'll see, there's a line which I will be coming back to later on, which is a very good definition, as far as definition is possible, of what the mantra is. Intuitive knowledge leaping into speech, seized, vibrant, kindling with the inspired word, hearing the subtle voice that clothes the heavens, carrying the splendor that has lit the suns. They sang infinity's names and deathless powers in meters that reflect the moving worlds, sights, sound waves breaking from the soul's great deeps. So this last line in particular, I'll come back to after we've been introduced a little bit more to what Sri Aurobindo says about the mantra and the conditions both for the poet receiving or composing or channeling the mantra, but also for the listener or reader of mantric poetry, which means the cultivation of the inner hearing. The main sections of this talk will be the 3rd and the 5th, the rhythms of Savitri, and the last part will be on word music apart from rhythm, because rhythm accounts for much of what we mean by the word music of Savitri, but there are other aspects. And in order to understand those aspects, I'll go a little bit into Sri Aurobindo's research on the nature of language and the concept of seed sounds, which is also mentioned in Savitri itself. So, to begin with the general question of how the mantra relates to poetry as such and not only to the Veda. I talked, actually I was going to talk about this subject a little bit at the end of my talk on Savitri and the Veda on Saturday, but ran out of time, so I'll incorporate some of that. I had put it under the heading, The Power of the Word. I'll incorporate some of that here, but it's not only the Vedic mantra here that we're talking about, and so the Vedic context is very interesting as a starting point, but we also have to see a little bit of what Sri Aurobindo said about poetry in general, the nature of poetry, because there are different ideas about the nature and purpose of poetry, and in order for poetry to be able to rise to the heights of the mantra, one has to have a certain conception of poetry, which Sri Aurobindo wrote a whole book about, of course, called The Future Poetry. So let's begin with a brief definition of the mantra from Sri Aurobindo's letters. The mantra is a word of power and light, first of all. Naturally, it's a word of light. The mantra expresses knowledge, but it's also a word of power, primarily power for an inner recreation of ourselves. A splendor of self-creation from the peaks is a line describing a certain stage in Ashwapati's yoga. The mantra brings the power for that self-creation through the power of a higher consciousness. So it brings down a higher power as well as giving the illumination that we would expect from it, whose characteristics are a language that conveys infinitely more than the mere surface sense of the words seems to indicate. Here he's talking about the meaning of the words primarily. The surface sense of the words is what we see immediately when we read a line of poetry. But in the case of the mantra, there's infinitely more to it than appears at first sight from the meaning of the words. But even more important, a rhythm that means even more than the language and is born out of the infinite and disappears into it. This, of course, is, as I was saying, something that cannot be explained. Nevertheless, one can say certain things about the technique of Savitri. Sri Aurobindo talked about technique with reference to Savitri, although he said that technique is only a small element in Savitri. Nevertheless, it at least gives us a starting point for becoming conscious of how the rhythm of Savitri works. And so let's go on, come back to the idea of power. The word has power. Even the ordinary written word has a power. If it is an inspired word, it has still more power. What kind of power or power for what depends on the nature of the inspiration and the theme and the part of the being it touches. So here, of course, we're concerned primarily with a spiritual power which touches the highest parts of the being, as Sri Aurobindo goes on to say. If it is the word itself, with a capital W, as in certain utterances of the great scriptures, Veda, Upanishads, Gita, to which now, of course, one has to add Savitri, it may well have a power to awaken a spiritual impulse, an uplifting, even certain kinds of realization. The Vedic poets regarded their poetry as mantras. They were the vehicles of their own realizations and could become vehicles of realizations for others, realization for others. Naturally, these mostly would be illuminations, not the settled and permanent realization that is the goal of yoga. but they could be steps on the way or at least lights on the way. Now the Veda itself talks about the mantra. It says quite a bit about the mantra, and as a matter of fact it uses several different words which are all combined when we speak of the mantra, but the word mantra itself is only one of the words that the Veda used in talking about these words of power, of spiritual power. Just to give a connection to the Veda itself, the original Vedic idea of the mantra, I'll just read a couple of verses from the Veda in Sanskrit with Sri Aurobindo's translation and comments. Gulham jyoti pitaro anvavindan satyamantra ajanayan nushasam. Our fathers, that means the ancient forefathers of the Vedic yogas in a still more ancient time. Our fathers found out the hidden light. By the truth in their thoughts, they brought to birth the dawn. Satya mantraha is translated here by the truth in their thoughts, but it means a little more than that. Sri Aurobindo explains, it is by the Satya mantra, the true thought expressed in the rhythm of the truth, that the hidden light is found and the dawn brought to birth. This was the basic victory of the ancient forefathers who found the path that the rishis followed. They found the hidden light, the light concealed in the subconscious, and they brought to birth the dawn of the spiritual consciousness. But they did this by the power of the word, expressed the true thought, expressed in the rhythm of the truth. So there are two aspects. There are always two aspects: the idea of the mantra and the sound, the rhythm. Now, just to give a couple of examples of other ways that the rishis talked about the mantra. Rik is what is the name for a verse of the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is the Veda of Riks. So, and Rik, Sri Aurobindo translates the hymn of illumination. It's related to the word arka, which can also mean the sun. It has the idea of illumination. It is by singing the Rik, the hymn of illumination, that they find the solar illuminations in the cave of our being, the cave of the subconscious. It is by the stub, the all-supporting rhythm of the hymn, that Indra becomes full of the power of swar. Stub is related both to another word for the mantra, the stoma, which we'll see in a moment, but also it's related to words like stamba, pillar. It has to do with sta, the root sta, to stand. So it gives the idea of the supporting rhythm. Indra, the god of the higher planes of the mind, becomes full of the power of swar, the heavens of that higher consciousness. For this cry is the voice of the higher heaven, the thunder that cries in the lightning flash of Indra. This is the lightning flash of inspiration, which also carries with it the thunder. The flash of light is the flash of revelation, drishti, of the vision of the truth, and the thunder that goes with it is the sound of the inspiration that accompanies that revelation. Those are two of the higher faculties that Indra represents. And then just a few more lines. This is the source, one of the sources of the Vedic use of the words Rik and Stub. Brihaspati pratamam jayamano maho jyotisha parame vyomam saptasyastu vijato ravena visaptarashmir adhamattamasi sasushtu-bhasa rikvita ganena valam ruroja haligam ravena. Brihaspati, coming first to birth out of the great light in the highest heaven,
born in many forms, seven-mouthed, seven-rayed, Saptasya, Saptarashmi. By his cry, dispelled the darkness. By the sound of his cry, Brihaspati is the master of wisdom. He, by his host, with the rik and the stub, the hymn of illumination and the rhythm that affirms the gods, broke Vala by his cry. Vala is the chief of the Panis who imprison the illuminations of the higher consciousness, the herds of the sun, and withhold them from the rishis in a cave in the mountain representing the physical being. So this gives just a glimpse of the way that the Veda speaks of the mantra. And finally, the verse that Sri Aurobindo refers to most often, although it doesn't use the word mantra, but the word stoma, which Sri Aurobindo translates the hymn of affirmation, is this one. Eshava stomo maruto namaswan hridatashto manasadhayi devaha. Lo, the hymn of your affirmation, O Maruts. It is fraught with my obeisance. It was framed by the heart. It was established by the mind, O ye gods. Sri Aurobindo comments, the process of formation of the mantra is described along with the conditions of its effectivity. Fashioned by the heart, Hrida Tashtaha. It receives its just place in the mentality through confirmation by the mind. Manasa Dhayi. It is put in its right place in the mentality by the mind. And it's from that role of the mind that the word mantra comes. But that aspect of the mantra is only one. There are several other words besides these that are used in the Veda for the mantra. For example, Gayatri or Gayatra is the mantra as the means of attainment, Sama as the means of the harmonization of the different parts of the being, and then there are a few other words. Sri Aurobindo goes on in commenting on that verse. The mantra, though it expresses thought in mind, is not in its essential part a creation of the intellect. To be the sacred and effective word, it must have come as an inspiration from the supramental plane, termed in Veda Ritam, the truth, and have been received into the superficial consciousness either through the heart or by the luminous intelligence, Manisha. Perhaps I should mention that supramental here, in fact, although the hyphen has come at the margin, Sri Aurobindo has hyphenated the word and uses it to mean whatever is above the mind, not strictly speaking what we understand by the supermind as the highest plane above the mind, beyond even the overmind. But all of those higher planes of which Indra is the Lord are referred to here. For the most part, that's important because Sri Aurobindo made it clear that even in Savitri, there's no direct expression of the supermind, that it's at the highest, the mantra is the word of the overmind, and then there are several other planes in between, higher mind, illumined mind, intuition. The mantra can come from any of those higher planes, but in any case, it's not a creation of the intellect. If it's a creation of the intellect, it's not the mantra. So these passages have been from writings by Sri Aurobindo on the Veda. Now I'm going to turn to what Sri Aurobindo says. Well, this is the human cycle actually, but primarily we're going to be looking now at what he says in the future poetry in trying to understand the nature of the mantra. To us, poetry, to us that means in the modern age, poetry is a revel of intellect and fancy. Imagination, a plaything and caterer for our amusement, our entertainer, the notch girl of the mind. But to the men of old, the poet was a seer, a revealer of hidden truths. Imagination, no dancing courtesan, but a priestess in God's house, commissioned not to spin fictions, but to image difficult and hidden truths. So the word kavi in the Veda doesn't mean just a poet, as later on, it means a rishi and a seer. Later on, it came to mean just a poet and became more and more what Sri Aurobindo describes in the first part of this passage as a revel of intellect and fancy. But Sri Aurobindo has extended the concept of the mantra to modern poetry in modern languages such as English. So we also have to see how the mantra relates to the ordinary conception of poetry, and in particular to English poetry. About that, Sri Aurobindo says, to the ordinary mind, judging poetry without really entering into it, it looks as if it were nothing more than an aesthetic pleasure of the imagination, the intellect, and the ear, a sort of elevated pastime. Pleasure, certainly, we expect from poetry as from all art, but the external, sensible, and even the inner imaginative pleasure are only first elements. Even what is called rasa in Indian aesthetics doesn't reveal the full secret of the possibilities of what can be expressed through poetry, at least not as usually understood. For these must not only be refined in order to meet the highest requirements of the intelligence, the imagination, and the ear. That's what is done in the arts ordinarily, and what the theory of rasa describes, this process of purification, refinement, and so on. Aristotle called it catharsis in the Western tradition. So this refinement of our ordinary experience is an important stage, but one has to go still further so that they may become the support for something greater beyond them. Otherwise, they cannot lead to the height on which lives the mantra. So what replaces finally the aesthetic pleasure of the ordinary conception of poetry and the arts is this divine ananda. A divine ananda, a delight, interpretative, creative, revealing, formative. One might almost say an inverse reflection of the joy which the universal soul felt in its great release of energy when it rang out into the rhythmic forms of the universe, the large interpretative idea, the life, the power, the emotion of things packed into an original creative vision. Such spiritual joy is that which the soul of the poet feels, and which, when he can conquer the human difficulties of his task, he succeeds in pouring also into all those who are prepared to receive it. That means us, ideally. When we read Savitri, if we can read it in the right way, because Sri Aurobindo clearly experienced this spiritual joy. He calls it in a line in Savitri, a joy of light, a joy of sudden sight. This kind of joy is what the inspiration brings with her lightning feet. And it brings that to the poet. But then when we read the poet, we reverse that process and go from the word on the page back to the source in this spiritual joy. So now let's come to a more detailed analysis of what is involved in the rhythmic word, which is the word of poetry. Because without some kind of rhythm, you have prose. Even prose, in fact, has a kind of rhythm, but especially in poetry. Even if there's not meter, there is rhythm of some kind. But the rhythmic word has a subtly sensible element, its sound value, perceptible to the senses, what we hear. A quite immaterial element, its significance or thought value. So that's the meaning associated with the word, which belongs to another plane, the mental plane. And both of these, again, its sound and its sense, have separately and together a soul value, a direct spiritual power which is infinitely the most important thing about them. It's interesting that he says that they have separately as well as together this soul value. That means the sound by itself has the soul value, even apart from the sense that we associate with the word. The sense, of course, has a soul value. Mostly Sri Aurobindo uses words in Savitri which we can easily associate with some kind of soul value. But the more challenging thing is to appreciate how the sound also expresses this soul value. And though this comes to birth with a small element subject to the laws of technique, especially the aspect of sound is governed by certain laws of technique, yet almost immediately, almost at the beginning of its flight, its power soars up beyond the province of any laws of mechanical construction. So we're going to see that the meter that Sri Aurobindo uses in Savitri looks extremely mechanical at first sight. I'll come to that in a moment. And yet the use of the meter, again, to a certain extent, the use of the meter also can be explained according to somewhat mechanical rules of what is permissible and not in the use of the iambic pentameter. But real poetry almost immediately soars up beyond anything that can be analyzed and explained in terms of the construction of the lines. So this would be the difficulty, and yet I think it's helpful to know something about the laws of technique as a starting point. So mostly here we're talking about rhythm. Primarily at first, we'll start with rhythm and come to other aspects of the word music later. Rhythm is the premier necessity of poetical expression because it is the sound movement which carries on its wave the thought movement in the word. Here we have the sound waves from that line at the end of the passage I read at the beginning. Sights, sound waves breaking from the soul's great deeps. So this wave, this idea of waves of sound is going to keep coming back in what Sri Aurobindo says about poetry, and especially the mantric poetry. And it is the musical sound image which most helps to fill in, to extend, subtleize, and deepen the thought impression or the emotional or vital impression, and to carry the sense beyond itself into an expression of the intellectually inexpressible. He hasn't been mentioning specifically the emotional or vital impression, which he's been including together with the sense of the word, but that's equally important, the emotional aspect of what is expressed as well as the ideas. But it's the sound, again, if one wants to reach the highest heights of what can be done in poetry, the sound image becomes crucial. And although that doesn't, strictly speaking, require meter, in the future poetry, Sri Aurobindo speaks with considerable admiration of certain pioneers of free verse, which has become the dominant mode of writing poetry now, particularly Walt Whitman, in English. And of course you have vers libre in French and so on. It's the general modern trend has been to break away from all of the old conventions. And but to a certain extent in treating meter as a convention and discarding it as unnecessary for poetry, modern poets have thrown out the baby along with the bathwater, and they've ended up impoverishing poetry by not, for the most part, making the full use of this possibility of meter, which Sri Aurobindo explains the rationale of here in the future poetry. When mankind found out the power of thought and feeling thrown into fixed and recurring measures of sound. Fixed and recurring measures of sound. This is the basic characteristic of any kind of meter. They're very different types of meter in different languages, quantitative meter in ancient languages like Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, accentual meters like English, and there are other possibilities. But still, meter means fixed and recurring measures of sound. Even in Chinese poetry, you have that. To move and take possession of the mind and soul, they were not discovering a mere artistic device, but a subtle truth of psychology, of which the conscious theory is preserved in the Vedic tradition, where it is called chandas. And Sri Aurobindo says there is perhaps a truth in the Vedic idea that the spirit of creation framed all the movements of the world by chandas, in certain fixed rhythms of the formative word. A balanced harmony maintained by a system of subtle recurrences is the foundation of immortality. This is a very philosophical explanation of what meter is. A balanced harmony maintained by a system of subtle recurrences is the foundation of immortality in created things, and metrical movement is nothing else than creative sound grown conscious of this secret of its own powers. So this is something which obviously has a much larger significance than just poetry. And Sri Aurobindo speaks of this in Savitri itself, in this passage. Inaudible to our deaf mortal ears, the wide world rhythms wove their stupendous chant, to which life strives to fit our rhyme beats here, melting our limits in the illimitable, tuning the finite to infinity. So this is a good way of understanding what one can get from Savitri, just from the point of view of entering into the rhythm of Savitri, which is a reflection of these cosmic rhythms. And so with that introduction to the relation between poetry as such and the mantra, we can go on to the conditions both on the part of the poet and the part of the audience for opening to the inner content of the mantra, which is not just what appears on the surface, either in terms of the sound or the sense, but the soul value which is behind both of them. And again, rhythm is the starting point, but here Sri Aurobindo speaks of a rhythmical soul movement and says it is from a certain point of view the rhythm, the poetic movement, that is of primary importance. For that is the first fundamental and indispensable element without which all the rest, whatever its other value, remains unacceptable to the muse of poetry. But it is not merely metrical rhythm, even in a perfect technical excellence, which we mean when we speak of poetic movement. That perfection is only a first step, a physical basis. Sri Aurobindo considered it a very necessary basis, and from this point of view of technical excellence, Savitri is flawless. You won't find a single line, for example, which has less than the 10 syllables required by the iambic pentameter. And there's a technical perfection, but it's only the first step. There must be a deeper and more subtle music, a rhythmical soul movement entering into the metrical form and often over-flooding it. For there is an inner hearing which makes its greater claim, and to reach and satisfy it is the true aim of the creator of melody and harmony. So there's the outer ear, and poetry pleases the outer ear. That's the secret of the popularity of metrical poetry, especially throughout the world, which is something that keeps coming back even when poets try to get rid of it. A certain sensuous satisfaction of meter and rhyme. But in fact, the word rhythm is only part of what we hear. It is a support for the rhythm we listen to behind in the ear of the ear, shrotrasya shrotram. Here Sri Aurobindo quotes the Kena Upanishad when he speaks of the ear of our ear, or the hearing of our hearing. Shrotrasya shrotram manaso manoyad vacho havacham sa upranasya pranaha chakshushash chakshur atimuchya dhiraha pretyasma loka damrita bhavanti. That which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight. So these are the deeper sources of our physical senses as well as our surface mind and vitality, that there's something deeper behind all these things which belongs to higher planes. These are the higher planes through which Ashwapati passes in Savitri, in the book of the Traveler of the Worlds, most systematically. And so when Sri Aurobindo says the wise are released beyond and they pass from this world and become immortal, it means that they're no longer limited by this world and the mortality that goes along with it. They realize the consciousness of immortality and they have access to higher worlds, but it doesn't mean that they cannot come back to this world, as we see in Savitri in the case of Ashwapati. But Ashwapati does have access to these higher worlds, and in the description of these worlds one gets some clues to what is expressed in Savitri, because so much of the content of Savitri itself doesn't pertain to the physical world at all, but is a record of what Sri Aurobindo called in his diary the record of yoga. Trailokya Gati is the most basic form, access to movement through the three worlds, physical, vital, mental. Of course, there are even higher worlds to which one can have access. But this is the freedom of access to other worlds, which comes through developing these subtle senses, as well as the general development of the consciousness. And here, Sri Aurobindo says in one of those cantos in the book of the Traveler of the Worlds, the Paradise of the Life Gods, he met the forms that divinize the sight. This would be chakshushash chakshuhu, the eye which sees these forms. To music that can immortalize the mind and make the heart wide as infinity, listened. Here he seems to be speaking of music proper, not word music, but he makes a transition then to word music, which is referred to when he says to music that can immortalize the mind and make the heart wide as infinity, listened and captured the inaudible cadences that awake the occult ear. Out of the ineffable hush it hears them come, trembling with the beauty of a wordless speech. So the words of Savitri often seem to tremble with this beauty of a wordless speech. And this is the source of that unearthly beauty which we often feel in Savitri. It comes from this wordless speech that comes from higher planes, and yet it expresses itself through the words even of our down-to-earth English language. So now we come specifically to the question of rhythm, and this is where I'm going to have to go into certain technicalities. But first I have to talk a little bit more about English, or Sri Aurobindo speaks of the possibilities of English, because it's not at all obvious at first sight that one would have expected the mantra to be a concept which is applicable to a language so different from Vedic Sanskrit as modern English is. The whole nature of the language is entirely different. The whole mentality which has created the English language is worlds removed from Vedic Sanskrit. And yet, Sri Aurobindo found English to have great possibilities for poetry, not only beautiful poetry, but even the highest, most inspiring and revelatory poetry. And he explains how that is possible in this passage in the Future Poetry, where he says, "We have the fortunate accident of the reshaping of a Teutonic tongue by French and Latinistic influences, which gave it clearer and more flowing forms." The French and the Latinistic influences gave it clearer and more flowing forms than German, for example, typical Teutonic tongue, and turned it into a fine, though difficult, linguistic material. Fine, though difficult, sufficiently malleable, sufficiently plastic for poetry to produce in it both her larger and her subtler effects, but also sufficiently difficult to compel her to put forth her greatest energies. In a sense, for example, Latin and French themselves, although perhaps more appealing immediately to the ear than English, lack something which was contributed by this heavier influence of the Teutonic tongue, which compels poetry to put forth her greatest energies. On the whole, therefore, it is here among European tongues that there is the largest present chance of the revolution of the human spirit finding most easily its poetic utterance. So this is what Sri Aurobindo began to do in poetry long before he started to write Savitri. But Savitri was certainly the culmination of this effort to find a poetic utterance in English for the revolution of the human spirit, to which he was a major contributor. Another aspect, it is also here by the union of a great vital energy and a considerable possibility of the spiritual vision that is a result partly of the meeting of East and West. The possibility of a spiritual vision came partly from the influence of India on Europe in general and English culture in particular. It is also here by the union of a great vital energy and a considerable possibility of the spiritual vision, which in English is also there from the Celtic element. Sri Aurobindo brings that out in the Future Poetry. You have the Teutonic and the Celtic elements, the vital energy and the spiritual vision, that there may be most naturally a strong utterance of that which most has to be expressed, the seen and realized unity of life and the spirit. In other words, this is all about bridging spirit and matter. Sri Aurobindo considered poetry to be one of the main means of doing that, expressing the realized unity of life and the spirit. So now we come to the boring part, which is meter. And at first it looks really boring. Iambic pentameter. Da-da, 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 da-da. That's the rhythm that Sri Aurobindo uses. It's not actually the rhythm. You won't find that any line in Savitri that sounds like that. But that's the underlying framework of the iambic pentameter. It's the definition of the iambic pentameter. And it's perhaps the most monotonous formula that you can find in any language for meter. And yet it has very powerful possibilities. And those possibilities are what we're going to see, how Sri Aurobindo explains what can be done with this apparently mechanical meter, the most mechanical meter that you can imagine. But first of all, even a line with 5 I-ams can be very powerful. Here and there you have lines in Savitri. A small minority of the lines in Savitri actually do consist rhythmically of 5 I-ams. And some of those are extraordinary lines. So, for example, when Sri Aurobindo puts in the mouth of Savitri this great affirmation of the human spirit against the negations of death, near the end of Book 9 of Savitri, where Savitri's debate with death begins, and in reply to death's reasoning, she says, "O death, I reason not." And then she says, "Reason that scans and breaks but cannot build. I am, I love, I see, I act, I will." So there, rhythmically, you have 5 I-ams, but you won't find any other line either in Savitri or anywhere else in English poetry, which is quite like this. These 5 I-ams, each I-am itself is a great affirmation of an aspect of not just the human consciousness, but what manifests through the human consciousness. And so Savitri is making this great affirmation against the negations of death. So this is perhaps certainly one of the most powerful examples of the use of the basic framework of the iambic pentameter, these 5 very simple feet. Iam just means short, long, or an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. There are other examples. A more typical example is in the last canto of the book of the Traveler of the Worlds, the Kingdoms of the Greater Mind, where on the overmental plane, Ashwapati realizes this cosmic consciousness of the overmind, and it's expressed, his consciousness on that plane is expressed through this line: "He thought and felt in all, his gaze had power." Again, you have 5 iams, and here the word rhythm corresponds closely to the metrical rhythm. He thought and felt in all, his gaze had power. Those are 5 iambic expressions. But that is not always the case. In fact, much more often you have some words in the line which will have a trochaic rhythm, which is the opposite, a falling rhythm rather than a rising rhythm. The iam, you could say, has a rising rhythm, whereas the trochee is a long syllable followed by a short syllable, or stressed, unstressed, as in the words lightning, cosmic, in this line. He rode the lightning seas of cosmic mind. That line occurs in the same canto. Again, Sri Aurobindo makes powerful use of a rhythm with 5 iams metrically, but there's an interplay between the metrical iambic rhythm and the trochaic word rhythm in some places. And a particularly good example of that occurs in the Book of Fate. An awful silence watches tragic time, where all the words except the first and the last actually have a falling trochaic rhythm. Awful silence watches tragic. In every case you have the stress on the first syllable. So, and yet it's a perfectly iambic line, metrically speaking. But Sri Aurobindo uses many other possibilities of English rhythm in Savitri, and unfortunately the jargon with which one has to speak about these rhythms that are possible, which Sri Aurobindo uses, and this is the jargon that he himself uses, which at one time every English-educated person would have known, because everybody learned this terminology in in school. Now we don't, for the most part. But still, one doesn't need to learn all of these terms in order to read Savitri, but it helps to know the variety of different rhythms that can be used in spite of the definition of the meter as consisting purely of one particular type of foot. The first one, the ayam, short, long. If you add another short syllable, you get an anapest, short, short, long. A pyrrhic is just two short syllables, and a spondy is just two long syllables. A trochee, I mentioned, is the inverse of an ayam, long, short, and a dactyl is likewise the inverse of an anapest. You have the long syllable first, and then the two short syllables. This is the meter that Sri Aurobindo used brilliantly and magnificently in Ilion, his epic on a Homeric theme, in which he used the Homeric meter, the great dactylic hexameter meter used for the Greek and Latin epics. He adapted it to English and showed that this is possible even in English. Sri Aurobindo spent, in fact, a remarkable amount of time exploring these technical possibilities of what can be done in English poetry using all these different rhythms. And the fruit of all that is in Savitri, even though for the most part one would rather not scan the lines of Savitri. Nevertheless, they can be scanned, and if you're going to do it and analyze them using this terminology, you have to use all of these words. The Bakayas is maybe a less common foot in pattern in English and even in Savitri, but it does occur short, long, long. We'll see a few examples of that. So all of these can be used without breaking the iambic rhythm if it's done skillfully. And Sri Aurobindo did it with enormous skill, so that the basic iambic feeling of the lines was always preserved, even though very often there was only one iamb in a line. So this is one example, and it also shows how effective these variations and modulations of the use of other feet can be for expressive purposes. This is not just some kind of verbal acrobatics. It expresses, these different rhythms express the content of what Sri Aurobindo is saying. Here he's talking about Trikal Drishti and the experience of time from the overmental standpoint, where past, present, and future are seen in one continuous movement. And he says there, its inevitable and continuous stream, the long flow of its manifesting course, were held in spirit's single wide regard. So this line expresses that stream of time, the continuity, and there's no, it's a line which consists entirely of short syllables, except for the very last word. So it has two pyrrhics in the middle, just feet consisting just of two short syllables, a couple of anapests, which have the extra short syllable added to the iamb, and only one iamb in the fourth foot. Its inevitable and continuous stream. Of course, when one reads the line, one doesn't scan it in one's mind, but if you want to analyze how the effect is produced, that's the way you have to do it. This is a very different rhythm, which uses a whole different set of the possible modulations and variations on the basic rhythm of the iambic pentameter, trochees, dactyls, and spondies, as well as a pyrrhic. Silence, swallowing life's acts into the deeps. So there the iamb comes at the end. And then this is another one. This has a kind of busy rhythm to it. This introduces the more complex bakayas in the third foot, And this rhythm expresses this murmur and babble and stir, which he's talking about in the mind, the normal activity of the mind. All is 100-toned murmur and babble and stir. The sound of the line creates a very different effect from what you get from either of the previous examples, which also have just one iamb, and certainly very different from the lines which have 5 iambs. And this is only a glimpse of the almost unlimited possibilities of variations on the actual line rhythm, the rhythm of each line, which has an underlying pulsation of the 5 iambs, but really the pentameter is just that. It's a pulsation which is felt under the actual rhythm, but the actual rhythm is unique in each line. So every line has its own rhythm, unless there's, for some particular purpose, Sri Aurobindo deliberately uses exactly the same rhythm in more than one line. He sometimes does that when he wants to have a kind of couplet effect, where he has 2 almost identical lines with just a small change, and so you'll have the same rhythm repeated. But normally you have almost 24,000 lines in Savitri, and one could try to catalog the number of different rhythms just in terms of the scansion like this. But still, we're only scratching the surface of the possibilities of what can be done with the iambic pentameter so far. In order to go deeper, it's important to make use of an essay that Sri Aurobindo wrote when his collected poems and plays were published in 1942, which consisted of all of his poems and plays that had been published up to that time. Most of the book consisted of that, but then at the end he wanted to introduce Ilion, which he had worked on, the epic in dactylic hexameters that I mentioned, although he never finished Ilion. It was an epic which was half finished when Sri Aurobindo took up Savitri, and it gradually dropped off, and Sri Aurobindo turned more and more of his energy to Savitri, and although he still intended to come back to Ilion, but he never finished it, and he only published part of the first book. But he accompanied that with some other experiments in possibilities, the possibilities of what he called quantitative meter in English. And he wrote a long essay called On Quantitative Meter. Now, this was something that interested English poets, particularly in the late 19th century, and there were a number of well-known and not so well-known poets who made attempts at using the ancient Greek and Latin meters in English, adapting these meters that were designed for a language which made a very clear distinction between long and short vowels, and which didn't have any prominent element of accent or stress, which is the basis of English rhythm. So English is primarily an accentual language, and Greek and Latin, as well as Sanskrit, are quantitative languages. The rhythm is quantitative, and the meters are defined by the length of the syllables, not just the length of the vowels, because consonants after a syllable also affect the length. And we'll see that that plays a small role even in Sri Aurobindo's theory of English quantitative meter, this factor of the consonants. But here he describes the accentual system in English, but he's going to point out that quantitative elements are also possible. And it's interesting that in his essay on quantitative meter, apart from discussing the possibility of whether one can model English poetry on these ancient systems of the classical languages, in spite of the difference between a quantitative basis and an accentual basis. He also analyzes passages, for example, he analyzes in detail a passage from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, and shows how it can be read from the point of view of quantitative meter. And so that gives us a clue that when Sri Aurobindo wrote on quantitative meter, he wasn't just thinking about Ilian and his other experiments. Ahana is another one, his other long poem in quantitative meter. He wasn't just thinking of those poems, he was also thinking of the possibilities of extending the possibilities of the accentual rhythm of normal English poetry, including the use of the iambic pentameter, as in Savitri. And as a matter of fact, he was, at the time when he wrote the essay on quantitative meter, he was taking up Savitri again after setting it aside for a while when he had his accident in 1938. He came back to Savitri, and much of the first part of Savitri, the whole first half of the poem, was written during this period, beginning, especially, he did very concentrated work on Savitri in 1942, which was the year of the publication of On Quantitative Meter. So this is certainly relevant to Savitri, even though Savitri is basically written in an accentual meter and not a quantitative meter. So we have to take that into account, and what Sri Aurobindo says here is very helpful for understanding that the rhythm of Savitri as well as English poetry in general. What we really have is a system of recurrent strokes or beats intervening at a fixed place in each foot. So you have a fixed number of feet, and at a fixed place in each foot you have a recurrence of a kind of beat. While the syllables which are not hammered into prominent place by this kind of stroke or beat, fill the interspaces. So a regular metrical base is thus supplied, but the rhythm can be varied or modulated by departures from the base, from it, but always upon it. Now, if one didn't have this regular metrical base, you would just have free verse. And free verse is something which, despite all that is claimed for it, is rather amorphous, and it's very difficult to find a really satisfying rhythm in most of what goes under the name of free verse, at least to my ear. And Sri Aurobindo also, although he appreciated some of the attempts at free verse, he never felt that free verse could supplant metrical poetry, which has this regular metrical base underlying it. In the case of Savitri, the iambic pentameter. The rhythm can be varied or modulated, not only can, but must be varied or modulated. If you have a long poem like Savitri, it would become, the monotony would become intolerable after a few lines of 5 iambs, if that was the actual rhythm of the line and not just the underlying metrical base. But still, you can't break the iambic feeling of the line. Sri Aurobindo also discusses some other lines which have only one iamb, as I've shown you occur in Savitri. He uses a very striking example from an Elizabethan dramatist, Webster. But in any case, this is the basic idea, and he points out there that although there's only one iamb in that line, that there's a metrical, underlying iambic feeling is preserved, and that's what Sri Aurobindo always does in Savitri, through a skillful use of these modulations and variations. But then we come to the next point, and this is where quantitative meter comes in. Inherent quantity. That means that even in English, although we don't distinguish I, u, very clearly, as in Indian languages, most Indian languages. In English, there's still a difference between short vowels and long vowels, even though it's not, it's overshadowed by the role of accent and stress in the rhythm of English. But still it's there. It's a component of English which can be made use of if, for the purpose that Sri Aurobindo says here, inherent quantity combined with distribution of stress. Even stress he distinguishes from accent. He treats accent as a rise in pitch, which without necessarily an increase in the volume of the sound, the weight of the voice on the syllable. Whereas stress he describes as a hammer stroke, we'll see in a moment, is a definite emphasis given to one syllable. He gives some examples of lines which have a regular accentual rhythm of iambs, and yet one of the iambs is only a kind of conventional iamb without a real stress. He takes I might as well give this example. The way was long, the wind was cold, the minstrel was infirm and old, is an example that Sri Aurobindo uses. And he points out that in the second foot of the second line, the minstrel was infirm and old. It's not the minstrel was infirm and old. The was is not stressed. There's a minor accentual inflection, as he puts it, on that syllable. And that is important actually to know for reading Savitri, so that one doesn't start off, it was the hour. Was is not nearly as important as hour. And if one doesn't know that, one can misread Savitri, and then, ideally, one should try to read Savitri with an understanding of these aspects of the rhythm that Sri Aurobindo explains here. And so, stress is also a factor, and we'll see some examples of that now. Because Sri Aurobindo clearly distinguishes three factors determining syllable length. What he calls length is not just syllable length, is not just vowel length. I'll give examples of all of these, so I hope this will become clear. The voice weight on a vowel is determined in three different ways. There is a dwelling of the voice, or there is its rapid passing. That difference decides its natural length. It creates the inherent or intrinsic long or short. So that's like the difference between a short and a long I. A short I is I, a long I is I. They're actually quite different sounds. But in any case, conventionally, we regard those as short and long forms of the same vowel in English. In any case, there are these differences here. I'll give an example from Savitri. The first case, which is what he calls the dwelling of the voice, which creates an inherent long vowel in the case of several of the words in this line. To house God's joy and things, space gave wide room. Now, I've given the metrical rhythm, the scansion for the metrical rhythm, where, for example, God actually has a short, things is even a better example. Things has definitely a short I. But because it's accented and stressed, it counts metrically as a long syllable. But most of the long syllables, the metrically long syllables, also have this inherent vowel length. House, the ow sound is a very long sound. It's even longer than an O, for example. Joy, space gave wide room. You have 4 long vowels in a row. So that creates a very different effect from this line, the rapid footsteps of her fantasy. There you have a series of short vowels, and even the ones that are stressed so that metrically the rapid footsteps has three long, metrically accented syllables because of the stress, which are considered metrically long. Nevertheless, the vowels are short. In rapid footstep, all of those are short vowels. They're not the inherent long vowels. So the rapid footsteps of her fantasy, that line takes about half as much time to read as to house God's joy in things space gave wide room. And that's because of this difference between the inherent vowel lengths, the long and the short. The second element is stress. There is, again, I'm still reading from On Quantitative Meter. This is what he says about the second element. There is, again, a vertical ictus weight of the voice, the hammer stroke of stress on the syllable. That of itself makes even a short vowel syllable metrically long. So a good example of that is this line, which describes the awakening of Savitri's inner strength at the moment of her confrontation with death. It bore the stroke of that which kills and saves. Now here you have long vowels in bore, stroke, and saves, inherently long vowels as well as strongly stressed. But the vowels in that and kills are short vowels, but they're very strongly stressed. And so that is what he says makes even a short vowel syllable metrically long. So this has to be scanned. Here I mark the stresses as well as the metrical length. But you have here another good example of the power of a line with 5 iambs. As long as it's surrounded by other lines with a variety of other rhythms, so that the iambic rhythm doesn't become monotonous, it can be very powerful in a case like this. Here you have a much more complex rhythm. In fact, this exemplifies the type of line that only has one iamb. Normally, I've never found a line in Savitri that doesn't have at least one iamb, but this is fairly common that you only have one. So you have a more irregular rhythm, and this is what Sri Aurobindo calls the distribution of stress. The stresses are distributed in an unusual way, which gives this a very unique rhythm. And here you see the hammer stroke, what he means by a hammer stroke of the weight of the voice on a syllable. The great hammer beats of a pent-up world heart. Again, it's a very powerful line which occurs in Book 1, Canto 5, the Yoga of the King, the Yoga of the Spirit's freedom and greatness. And he's realizing this overmind consciousness. In fact, in early versions of Savitri, this passage was immediately followed by what is now lines from Book 2, Canto 15, which is the kingdoms and goddess of the greater knowledge, where Sri Aurobindo specifically says he scanned the secrets of the overmind. So here he's using the power of this hammer stroke to give the maximum impact to especially the last 4 syllables, pent up, world heart. But pent and up each have a short vowel. So it's the stress which makes them metrically long and creates the rhythm of this line. But there's still another factor, although this is the least important and ordinarily is ignored in English poetry. Still, Sri Aurobindo shows why you can't ignore this element of consonantal weight. So he says, but yet again there is a third factor of length determination. There is consonantal weight, a lingering or retardation of the voice compelled by a load of consonants, or there is a free, unencumbered light movement. So this is very important in ancient quantitative languages with quantitative meters like Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, a syllable with a short vowel but followed by more than one consonant is counted as long. Ordinarily, Sri Aurobindo doesn't accept that in English because of the role of the accent in determining the actual rhythm. And English poets who tried to use this rule that two or more consonants after even a short vowel make it long have produced spectacular failures, some of which Sri Aurobindo analyzes in his essay on Quantitative Meter. But in any case, there are these possibilities that it can become significant, and there are cases, I'll show some examples of how the retardation of the voice compelled by a load of consonants can have a real effect on the rhythmic effect of the meter, as opposed to the free, unencumbered light movement where you don't have these clusters of consonants. So a remarkable example is this one in the Descent into Night, describing a nightmarish experience which Ashwapati has near the end of that canto, gripped, strangled by that lusting, viscous blot. So he's about to be swallowed into a huge belly of doom. And that is expressed in this line, which starts off with a spondee, which, however, has two short vowels, the short I and the short A. They're stressed, certainly, so that contributes to making the two short vowels into metrically long syllables. But primarily, it's the clusters of consonants between which these short vowels are almost strangled, gripped. The short I is gripped between four. First of all, you have a couple of consonants before it, followed by P, T, S, T, R following it. A great accumulation of consonants, gripped, strangled. So certainly this impedes the voice movement, and it's an example of what he means by a lingering or retardation of the voice compelled by a load of consonants. So the agony of this experience is prolonged by this load of consonants surrounding both of these poor short vowels at the beginning. So this is what Sri Aurobindo is doing with these technicalities of rhythm in order to express a very powerful, in this case a very dark but powerful experience. In contrast to this line, for example, hurried into unimaginable depths. There you don't have any clusters of consonants, and the line goes by, hurried in a great hurry, hurried into unimaginable depths, upborne into immeasurable heights, etc. This is again also from that canto, the yoga of the king, the spirit's freedom and greatness, and it's describing a great liberation that Ashwapati experiences. But we're talking now just about the rhythmic movement and the effect of the rapidity of his being hurried into these depths is created by the combination of inherently short vowels and a lack of any impediment in the consonants slowing down that movement, except at the very end, depths. There you have a short vowel, but you have a cluster of consonants after it. So these are examples, these are factors which Sri Aurobindo is constantly using in Savitri in subtle ways, and normally we don't pay any attention to them. But especially the first two are very important, I think, in reading Savitri, to give due weight to what Sri Aurobindo, how Sri Aurobindo is varying and enriching the rhythm and making it more expressive through his use of these elements of the possibilities of English rhythm, which it has in common with ancient languages which seem to have such a different sound system, and do have a very different sound system, and yet some of the same things can be done in English. Now, all three of these come together in this extraordinary line, which occurs near the end of the second canto, the issue, which summarizes the whole action of the poem. So here at the end, on the last page of the canto, Sri Aurobindo is describing what's going to happen several hundred pages later when Savitri finally defeats death. through the breaking in of this truth. This truth broke in a triumph of fire. So that's the line without any scansion or explanation of the rhythm. Fortunately, in this particular case, we have Sri Aurobindo's own detailed explanation of the rhythm of the line. So I've given the scansion now based on Sri Aurobindo's own scansion. Sri Aurobindo in a letter explained the rhythm of this line and started off with these technicalities of the scansion. The scansion is iamb, reversed spondi, pyrrhic, trochee, iamb. This truth is an iamb. Broke in is what he calls a reversed spondi. And he explains by reversed spondi, I mean a foot with the first syllable long and highly stressed. It has both the inherent length of the long O, but also stress on both syllables, including the short I of in. The second syllable is stressed but short, or with a less heavy ictus. One might give less weight to in than to broke, because broke is the main word after all. But both are stressed, and the in becomes metrically long, even though it's short, and the in that follows it, of course, is entirely short and has no stress. But this is the rhythm of the first half of the line. Pyrrhic, trochee, iamb is the second half of the line. Inna is the pyrrhic in a triumph of fire. The trochee is triumph, long, short. But he has more to say about both of these, and particularly, now this is the scansion, but why does he choose such an unusual rhythm for this particular line? In the first part of the line, the rhythm is appropriate to the violent breaking in of the truth. This truth broke in. While in the second half, in a triumph of fire, it expresses a high exaltation and exaltation in the inrush. And then particularly with regard to the second half of the line, he explains this exaltation and exaltation is brought about by the two long and highly stressed vowels in the first syllable of triumph and in the word fire. There are two long I's, so there's an assonance also of long I's, triumph and fire. And he points out that in the elocution of the line, these have to be given their full force. It's the only place, I think, where Sri Aurobindo has spoken of elocution, the importance of reading poetry with the right rhythm. But obviously he gave it great importance, and here it's crucial, and it also requires a considerable understanding of English rhythm in order to get this line right, to read it right in the way that Sri Aurobindo is describing. If Sri Aurobindo hadn't written this letter, we might have had trouble with the rhythm of this line. It requires a considerable understanding of English rhythm, really, to get understand what he's saying here. But his point here is precisely what I was saying about the importance of the quantitative element, because when he says that the long syllables, as well as highly stressed, of triumph, the first syllable, and fire, have to be given their full force, he's saying that these quantitative elements that we just talked about have to be fully recognized, and one can't just read it as an iambic, certainly not as an iambic line, but even as purely in terms of an accentual system of rhythm. It's an accentual system which is modified by quantitative elements. And then he explains the most technical detail, but it's absolutely crucial. If one slurs over the slightly weighted short syllable in triumph, where the concluding consonants exercise a certain check and delay in the voice. So here he's talking about consonantal weight, the third factor, that even the two consonants, M and the F sound of the PH, exercise a certain check and delay in the voice, which prevent one from passing over it too quickly if one is reading it sensitively. One could turn this half line in a triumph of fire into a very clumsy double anapest, where the break would be after the first syllable of triumph, between the I and the U, in a try, and then you would have a break, and you would have then only 4 feet in the line, which never happens in Savitri. There are always 5 feet. But without recognizing this, this factor of the weight of consonants slightly delaying the voice in the second syllable after the long and highly stressed first syllable of triumph. One has to also give a certain time for the second syllable and not pass over it too quickly, which would make it sound like the first syllable of an anapest leading into of fire. So he says the first would be a glide and the second a stumble. This would be bad elocution and contrary to the natural movement of the words. But as we can see here, Sri Aurobindo was expecting quite a bit of the readers of Savitri in order to read the lines correctly. So at the very least, I think one should make a certain effort to understand the basics of English rhythm if one wants to fully experience Savitri as mantra. More generally, he says, in these highest, intensest rhythms, which we've had a very good example of here, every sound is made the most of, whether in its suppression or in its swelling expansion, its narrowness or its open wideness. So you have that in the middle of the line, the two in was an example of 2 syllables which are passed over very quickly, suppressed, you might say. But the long syllables have to be given this swelling expansion, their open wideness, in order for the effect to be felt. So this is an aspect of raising the rhythm to a certain intensity, where every sound is made the most of. It's one of the characteristics of the mantra, that every sound counts. But then he goes on, this is only the technical side. It is not the artistic intelligence or the listening physical ear that is most at work, but something within that is trying to discover a secret of rhythmic infinities within us. That's the inner hearing that we talked about. So I think if one can get that inner hearing, if one can experience the deeper listening of the soul, as Sri Aurobindo calls it in Savitri itself, then one doesn't need to know so many technicalities about English meter and rhythm. One will get the rhythm right by listening to it with this inner ear and not just with the outer ear. And then he finishes this statement. It is a labor of the spirit within itself to cast something out of the surge of the eternal depths. So here we have again sights, sound waves, breaking from the soul's great deeps, the surge of the eternal depths. These are the soul's great deeps. So let's look at that line more closely. Sights, sound waves, breaking from the soul's great deeps. So let's look at that line in the light of everything we've seen about how the flexibility, first of all, of the rhythm based on the iambic pentameter, but constantly varied through the use of all the modulations that are possible within that rhythm. But also the factor of, especially here, the inherent vowel length, as well as the factor of stress. And so if we scan the line, and if you just look at the scansion, I haven't given the technical terms, but just the lengths indicated by the conventional signs for long and short. You have a remarkable number of long syllables in this line, with 3 short syllables in the middle. And these long syllables are not just long because of stress on the syllable, which sometimes happens, as we've seen, but also all the vowels are long. You have a long I, the ow, a, 2 long a sounds, o, another a, great, and deeps, finally, the long e sound. So you have 7 long vowels. In between you have 3 short syllables, and if we remember what Sri Aurobindo said about giving its full expansion to the long vowels and suppressing the more insignificant ones, giving its full weight to the sound, what you see in here is that you have the slow arrival of these sound waves in the first 4 syllables, sight sound waves. And then you have one more syllable, but when you reach the K of breaking, the waves break, and then you have a kind of swirl of short syllables. You have 3 short syllables, and then you return to the tranquility of the soul ocean in the last 3 long, again, very long syllables. Soul's great deeps. So sight sound waves breaking from the soul's great deeps. The sound actually expresses what is being described, that these sound waves are coming from these great deeps. There's a moment when they reach the surface, and that's the moment at which they break. And so this is the process of the composition of the mantra. You remember this was the last line of that sentence, which described how the rishis received the mantras of the Veda, and it ended with this line, which is a very good definition of the mantra. So, Sri Aurobindo points out that there are 3 factors in the mantra, and you have all 3 of them. Looking now not at the rhythm, but at the sense of this line, you have sight, sound, and soul. And in the future poetry, Sri Aurobindo says, what the Vedic poets meant by the mantra was an inspired and revealed seeing and visioned thinking that came on the wings of a great soul rhythm. So the revealed seeing is obviously the aspect of sight, and also the visioned thinking. Inspired for Sri Aurobindo always implies a hearing of what is of the truth, which is inspired, and you have the sound is represented by the rhythm chandas, but it's a soul rhythm. So it's the rhythmic soul movement. You have all 3 factors of sight, sound, and soul, and Sri Aurobindo goes on to make that clear. For the seeing could not be separated from the hearing. It was one act, nor could the living of the truth in oneself, in the soul, in other words, which we mean by realization, be separated from either. So, we're reaching the conclusion of this section on rhythm, and then we'll we have a little bit more time left for looking at the idea of the seed sounds and other aspects of word music. But the rhythm is the most important and also, I think, the most difficult aspect of the word music, and so I've spent most of the time on that. In any case, the result of all of this is something as near to wordless music as word music can get, and with the same power of soul life, of soul emotion, of profound supra-intellectual significance. This is the word music of the mantra, which is very near to wordless music, as we saw in that passage from the Paradise of the Life Gods, trembling with the beauty of a wordless speech. In these higher harmonies and melodies, the metrical rhythm is taken up by the spiritual. It is filled with, or sometimes it seems rolled away and lost in a music that has really another unseizable and spiritual secret of movement. It is where the metrical movement remains as a base, but either enshrines and contains, or is itself contained and floats in an element of greater music which exceeds it and yet brings out all its possibilities. that the music fit for the mantra makes itself audible. It is the triumph of the embodied spirit over the difficulties and limitations of the physical instrument. And this last sentence is very interesting to read in the light of what we know from Sri Aurobindo's diary, the record of yoga, about how he struggled with the physical instrument, partly as a condition for receiving the higher consciousness of the Vijnana, the various higher planes of consciousness, into the physical, that means into the brain mind. And I'll just give one example of an entry in the record of yoga from 1912, fairly early, 4 years before Sri Aurobindo even began to write Savitri. Sahitya is literature, but mostly in the record of yoga it refers to poetry. Sahitya is once more hampered by the refusal of the annam, the annamaya kosha, the food sheath, which the Upanishads talk about, the physical being, the physical instrument. The refusal of the annam to obey or even contain the Vijnanamaya movements of the Vak. The Vak is the word, but it's the word that comes from above. And the Vijnanamaya movements are the movements of these higher planes of consciousness expressing themselves through the Vak. And the main obstacle to expressing that, or even to allowing it to descend into the physical instrument, the adhara, and particularly into the brain. The main obstacle was this refusal of the inconscient element in the physical, the annam. So this is what he means when he says the difficulties and limitations of the physical instrument. We don't usually think of that when we think of inspired poetry, that the poet has to overcome the obstacles of the physical instrument. But if you think of poetry in terms of inspired poetry that expresses a higher consciousness but has to be put into words of a human language, that last stage of transmission occurs in the physical instrument, the adhara, and it can't be done without its participation. So the physical can create a very great obstacle to this. So now I'll look briefly at the idea of seed sounds, because the other aspects of word music that involve not the rhythm, the lengths and stress, but the different qualities of sounds. And those can be seen particularly if you look at alliteration of certain consonants, which sometimes seem to express quite different things. I'll show a few examples of that just before we conclude. But that could be treated just as a kind of play, musical, for the beauty, just for the beauty of sound. One can be playing with sounds, and certainly that has its own appeal, and it's part of the attraction of poetry. But according to Sri Aurobindo, these sounds had a deeper source. The sounds of language have their origins on a higher plane. And in Savitri he writes, an ear of mind withdrawn from the outwards rhymes. Again, it's this inner hearing, shrotrasya shrotram. An ear of mind withdrawn from the outwards rhymes discovered the seed sounds of the eternal word, the rhythm and music heard that built the worlds. So Sri Aurobindo was trying to discover these seed sounds, particularly through a study of Sanskrit, as well as other ancient languages such as Greek, Latin, and also Tamil. And he wrote a couple of, two fairly substantial drafts of an essay on the origins of Aryan speech, in which he presented the results of a work in progress which he never finished. He largely abandoned that work after he started to write the Arya. But in any case, he did arrive at certain interesting results. And those involve starting from words of Sanskrit for the most part, which he used as the basis of his study, and trying to find the significance of the seed sounds on which those words are built, how the sound and sense are related. But that involves a very different conception of language from that which is assumed by modern linguistics in the framework of basically materialistic science, the attempt to make linguistics a science of language. But for this purpose, one has to understand language in a different way in the light of a more ancient view of the nature of vak, the word. And Sri Aurobindo says, the words which we use in our speech seem to be, if we look only at their external formation, mere physical sounds, which a device of the mind has made to represent certain objects and ideas and perceptions. Linguistics has been based for at least 100 years on this assumption that it's a device of the mind which has arbitrarily associated certain objects and ideas with certain sounds. That is being questioned, has been questioned recently, even in modern linguistics. But Sri Aurobindo says, if we look at them in their inmost psychological and not solely at their more external aspect, we shall see that what constitutes speech and gives it its life and appeal and significance is a subtle conscious force which informs and is the soul of the body of sound. Of course, given Sri Aurobindo's whole philosophy and the role of conscious force in existence, the whole of manifestation, it could not be otherwise. But here it's being applied especially to the phenomenon of language. And that goes back to ancient times, Veda and Tantra. It is this force, this Shakti, to which the old Vedic thinkers gave the name of Vak, the goddess of creative speech. And the Tantric psychists supposed that this power acts in us through different subtle nervous centers on higher and higher levels of its force, and that thus the word has a graduation of its expressive powers of truth and vision. So that's very important for understanding the principle of the mantra, the very possibility of the mantra. There has to be a possibility of sound actually expressing something higher and higher levels, ideally. Sri Aurobindo spoke of Savitri as a means of ascension. He was trying to raise the level of expression to express higher and higher planes of consciousness. Now, for that to make sense, one has to see it in the context of an evolutionary philosophy and look at the origins of language differently from the way we usually do nowadays. Ordinary speech uses language mostly for a limited practical utility of communication. Sri Aurobindo is actually writing this in the future poetry. He brings in the results of his work on the origins of Aryan speech in one of the early chapters of the future poetry, because he considered it necessary even for understanding the possibilities of English poetry. So ordinary speech uses language for life and for the expression of ideas and feelings necessary or useful to life. In doing so, we treat words as conventional signs for ideas with nothing but a perfunctory attention to their natural force. When we wish to put a more vital power into them, we have to lend it to them out of ourselves, by marked intonations of the voice, by the emotional force or vital energy we throw into the sound. But if we go back earlier in the history of language, and still more if we look into its origins, we shall, I think, find that it was not always so. This arose from the primitive nature of language, which probably in its first movement was not intended so much to stand for distinct ideas of the intelligence as for feelings, sensations, broad, indefinite mental impressions. The intellectual sense in its precision must have been a secondary element, which grew more dominant as language evolved along with the evolving intelligence. This aspect, at least, of Sri Aurobindo's theory, it seems to me one should be able to present to linguists, or at least to philosophers of language, because it's a very logical point that he makes here, that we assume on the basis of our modern languages, highly mentalized as we now are today in the age of reason, we assume that language was always like that. It certainly makes sense to suppose that words might have expressed more emotions, sensations, vital movements at an earlier stage in its development. For the reason why sound came to express fixed ideas lies not in any natural and inherent equivalence between the sound and its intellectual sense. Sri Aurobindo agrees with modern linguists that the correspondence is not between the sound and its intellectual sense, or the object that the word represents. It started from an indefinable quality or property in the sound to raise certain vibrations in the life soul of the human creature. This must have given early language a powerful life, a concrete vigor, in one direction a natural poetic force which it has lost, however greatly it has gained in precision, clarity, utility. We certainly see this in much of ancient poetry, in the Homeric poems, for example, in the Western tradition, which are often regarded as the high point of Western literature, in spite of being written at a fairly rudimentary stage of the development of Greek culture, because of this powerful life that early language had. Now, poetry goes back in a way and recovers, though in another fashion, as much as it can of this original element. It does this partly by a greater attention to the suggestive force of the sound, its life, its power, the mental impression it carries. It associates this with the definitive thought value contributed by the intelligence and increases both by each other. In this way, it's possible that the mantra, if that natural vitality of ancient language can be recovered by the means Sri Aurobindo is talking about, but associating it with the development of the intelligence which has occurred since the ancient times, one could have an even more powerful expression in the mantra than the Vedic mantra itself, because it would have this additional element which was not possible at that time due to the contribution of the intelligence. It's the combination of these which gives the full possibility of the kind of mantra that Sri Aurobindo was trying to write in Savitri. And he uses the word mental impression in his writings on the origins of Aryan speech. He uses mental impression as a translation of the Sanskrit word guna, and he talks about the guna of the seed sounds, that each sound, each of the basic sounds of language has a certain guna, a quality, or a mental impression associated with it. So in that way, even modern poetry, by these means, partly by the greater attention to sound, it succeeds at the same time in carrying up the power of speech to the direct expression of a higher reach of experience than the intellectual or vital. For it brings out not only the definitive intellectual value of the word, as you have in, for example, The Life Divine, when Sri Aurobindo is writing about many of the same things as in Savitri, but he's doing it in prose and bringing out the intellectual. Of course, even there something higher comes through, but not in the same way as in Savitri. Not only its power of emotion and sensation, as in much of poetry, in Shakespeare, for example, was the high point of English poetry from that point of view, its vital suggestion. But through and beyond these aids, its soul suggestion, its spirit. So, I have time just to give one example of a particular root M, a particular seed sound, the sound, the M, which is the last sound in Om. And Sri Aurobindo wrote a short and unfinished essay called Roots in M, for which he actually, I think, used the Devanagari. The sound starts from the fundamental idea of finality. It occurs, we're going to look at the occurrences of M at the beginnings of words, but also in Sanskrit it occurs particularly at the end, where it gives the sense of finality. The endings, the accusative ending in Sanskrit usually is M, which gives the idea of finality. Limit, and it's partly the close, very often one can understand the significance of the seed sounds from the way they're pronounced. You close the lips. And that's like the end, as in Om, it gives the sense of finality. Limitation, close, confinement, depth, cavity, close embrace are its original significance. From the idea of limitation comes first to measure by limiting or marking off. So to form, construct or build, make. So to give a couple of examples of that idea in Savitri, where you have the M occurring not just once, but alliteration of M's in 3 words in each of these lines, which kind of reinforces the sound effect of the M. A master magician of measure and device. Their measure gives the basic idea that he's talking about of limiting or marking off. But magician is also related to that, and it's the one translation of Maya. Mayavin is the magician. In the other line, a manufactured lie of Maya's make. Maya comes from the idea of making, constructing, also imagining forms. And so here we have, and manufactured is another good example of M expressing this idea of forming, constructing, building, making, as well as the word make itself in English. It's surprising actually how often what Sri Aurobindo says in the origins of Aryan speech about these root sounds or seed sound, how often it's relevant even to English, partly because of the Latin element in English, or even the Germanic element in English. The Teutonic element is still Indo-European and belongs to broadly the same family of languages. But in any case, in English also, we have very often we can find words, and Sri Aurobindo makes good use of these words in Savitri, to which some of his observations about seed sounds in the origins of Aryan speech are applicable. From the idea of limitation or finality, we get, secondly, the sense of end, terminus, boundary, limit, of close or finale. So the close of all, death. Mortal is, of course, the main word that represents that, which comes from Latin. From the same idea of limitation, we get another shade of significance, the sense of confinement. So, a prisoner in the mortal's limiting world. You have both of those ideas there, of death, the close of all, and confinement, or entangled in matter's mortal littleness. Finally, from the sense of depth, hollowness, we get the idea of a deep sound, murmur. The idea of the extreme limit came to be specified in application to particular forms of extreme being, and to cover the idea of flourishing vigor, vigorous life or action, strength, swiftness. The idea of a goal strong in the ma sound seems also to have suggested movement towards a goal. So we have a mighty murmur of immense retreat. This is a good example of how by studying lines that are highly alliterative, one can get a feeling of what the M sound, in this case, stands for, what it communicates, just the sound itself. A mighty murmur of immense retreat. We have actually 4 M's, and immense, even 5 if you want to count the double, the one in immense as a double M. Or movement was married to the immobile vast. There again you have a number of M's, and there you have the idea of movement towards a goal. There are many other lines. The million mysteried movement of the One, for example, is another instance of that. And there you have the word mystery, which when Sri Aurobindo continues in his study of the root M, is another, it had to do with the idea of depth, of what is secret, because of closing the mouth, the idea of something secret. So, but also the million, the flourishing vigor, large numbers can be expressed through the sound. Yeah, million mysteried movement, and then movement as we have here. So even in English, one sometimes, not always, but we can find quite a bit of evidence, even in English, for the role of these seed sounds. This would be one of the seed sounds that was discovered by the in that line that referred to the seed sounds of the eternal word. An ear of mine withdrawn from the outwards rhymes discovered the seed sounds of the eternal word. Sri Aurobindo, of course, when he was writing The Origins of Aryan Speech, wasn't writing as an ordinary linguist. He was using intuitive faculties and using this inner listening to try to discover these seed sounds. So this is the point at which I was going to go into another subject, but in a way I've anticipated enough of what I was going to say about the word music of Savitri that one could go on indefinitely. I could go on for another 2 hours, but maybe I shouldn't do so. Shall I stop here then? You want me to go on? Okay, I can go on. Anybody, because it was announced that you can leave at 12:30. Okay, I'll go on as far as I actually want to come to something at the very end. I didn't put a separate heading for it, but I want to end with the lines on the mantra sinking in yoga's ear, because that describes the conditions for the mantra having its full effect. So I want to, at least, that would take just 5 minutes at the end, but I can do a little bit of what I have in mind for these other aspects of word music in Savitri. And first of all, I wanted to start with a passage in the third canto, the Yoga of the King, the Yoga of the Soul's Release. I quoted these lines in the talk on Savitri and the Veda about inspiration. And so let me just read a little bit of that. Oft inspiration with her lightning feet, a sudden messenger from the all-seeing tops, traversed the soundless corridors of his mind, bringing her rhythmic sense of hidden things. A music spoke, transcending mortal speech, as if from a golden phial of the all-bliss, a joy of light, a joy of sudden sight, the rapture of the thrilled, undying word poured into his heart as into an empty cup. It goes on, but I'll stop there. So this is about inspiration, and it's important to remember when we go into technicalities that inspiration is always the main thing. Sri Aurobindo, whenever he talks about technique, comes back to the fact that nothing can be done just by technique. Variations of rhythm as between the lines. Now he's talking specifically here about writing the kind of poetry he was writing in Savitri in the iambic pentameter, which has, as I pointed out at the very beginning, a danger of monotony because of the mechanical framework which underlies it. So one has to use great skill, but more than skill, also one has to make an inspired use of that meter in order to fully develop its mantric possibilities. So some of the factors are, we've seen some of them, variations of rhythm as between lines, the fact that you can't just have several lines in a row which are nothing but iambs, you have to vary the rhythm. Even if it's done mechanically, it's better than nothing. But it has to be a significant variation. The variations have to be expressive, or it's not good poetry. All English poets do this, but Sri Aurobindo has maybe carried it to a new height in Savitri. Variations of rhythm as between the lines, of caesura, that means of pauses within the line, of the distribution of long and short. We've seen some of that. Clipped and open syllables, this is another distinction. It has to do with whether even a long vowel is followed by a hard consonant that cuts it short, or whether it's allowed to go on expanding by not being followed by a consonant at all, or being followed by a consonant that still allows the voice to continue reverberating after the vowel is finished. So if you have a hard consonant like a K or a T or a P, for example, it'll cut the sound short. That's what he calls clipped. Clipped and open syllables. Manifold combinations of vowel and consonant sounds, alliteration, assonances, etc. These are the important things. It will be useful to talk particularly about alliteration, and if there's time, about assonance. Alliteration is repetition of the same consonant, usually at the beginning of a word, but I think one should count other forms of recurrence of the same consonant as alliteration. But at least the easiest examples to see are alliteration of initial consonants, how the word begins. Assonance is a repetition of the same vowel, usually within a word. That means between consonants, because most words begin with consonants, although words that begin with vowels form a particularly interesting group also. Then he goes on and says, but all that is usually taken care of by the inspiration itself. For as I know and have the habit of the technique, the inspiration provides what I want according to standing orders. He puts it a little flippantly here because the tone of Sri Aurobindo letters is always appropriate to the particular correspondent that he's writing to. And this letter was written to a particular sadhak who would have appreciated that way of looking at it. I may add that the technique does not go by any set mental rule, for the object is not perfect technical elegance according to precept, but sound significance filling out word significance. Word significance meaning the significance given by the meanings of the words, obviously. Sound significance means the significance of the sounds themselves, which is what we've been mostly talking about today. If that can be done by breaking rules, well, so much the worse for the rule. Sri Aurobindo was quite aware that some of his alliteration, for example, would be considered excessive by certain types of critics who would say that one should restrain one's use of these kinds of techniques and not overdo it. Sri Aurobindo sometimes seems to almost luxuriate in the possibilities of what can be done with alliteration and assonance, because he's trying to fill out the word significance with the sound significance, and it requires the full use of the possibilities of sound. So the easiest case to begin with of alliteration of word beginnings is both an example of what he says about what you need for variation. You can use alliteration for variation because the words in which sounds are repeated can occur in different parts of the line and different sounds and so on. So there's a great variety of possibilities. But also it's a good way to get at the seed sounds as far as it's possible, because when you see the same, as we already saw with the M, if the same sound is repeated several times in a line, that's likely to give us a better clue to at least the significance that Sri Aurobindo finds in that sound which he's trying to draw out of it, than if that's just a single occurrence of the sound, though it may express exactly the same thing, even if there's no alliteration. But let's start with the case, actually, although mostly we're talking about alliteration of consonants. When we talk about word beginnings, there is the class of words that begin with a vowel. And even the mere fact that a word begins with a vowel and not with a consonant, leaving aside which vowel it is, if you look at words that begin with the same vowel, then you're talking about assonance. But if you look at just the fact that the word begins with a vowel, that means that there's no consonant, and the absence of a consonant means the absence of a definite beginning. It's in linguistics, there's a technical term for that null onset of the word, that there's nothing, and then there's the sound, there's no consonant, nothing solid at the beginning of the word. So here Sri Aurobindo is expressing the intangibility of the objects of the subtle physical. And he does it through a line in which all of the important words begin with a vowel. There are no words beginning with a consonant. In other words, the emptiness, what appears to us as empty air, is expressed through sound, through this line, the objects that to us are empty air. It's partly the emptiness in terms of how the sound expresses the sense. It's simply the absence of a definite sound at the beginning of each of these words. Of course, the word objects is a common word, but because he strings together objects, empty, air, and even us is a stressed word here. So by bringing all of these words together, you can see that he's actually making use of a particular sound effect of beginning the word with a vowel, and that can express this type of absence. It is and acts unseen as if it were not. There you have no words at all beginning with consonants until the very last foot, were not. And even then, it's a semivowel and a nasal. And it's expressing the invisibility of this divine presence in us, which is there, whether we know it or not, but it mostly acts unseen and we're not even aware of it. So the absence in our surface consciousness of that presence is expressed in this way, through the absence of any solid consonant at the beginning of the words. This occurs at the end of the canto in Book 3, The Pursuit of the Unknowable, and actually it's preceded by two other words beginning with vowels, a silent cause, occult, impenetrable, infinite, eternal, unthinkable, alone. Now this is one of those lines where the spaces between the words are just as important as the words themselves. And note again that the words themselves begin in the same way as the last two examples, with a vowel, not with a consonant. And so there's nothing, he's talking about the absence of any limitations, the realization of the unknowable and the unthinkable. Occult, impenetrable, infinite, eternal, unthinkable, alone. It's mostly neti. It is not this, it is not that. Even infinite and eternal, you can take them as positive terms, but in fact they represent the absence of any limit in time or space or any other limit. So again, one can see how this is one possibility, and one can come up with many other examples of that in Savitri. So let's come to consonants, and I'll kind of start by going through the alphabet. So A is a vowel, so we start with B. Baffled and beaten back, we labor still. This is Ashwapati speaking in the Vision and the Boon. Baffled and beaten back. It's like blows raining down on us. There's a kind of accelerating movement of these blows, beaten back, and yet we labor still. So the B here has a very strong impact. It's one possibility of the B, which can be a very belligerent sound, you could say. As in this line, it's one of the references Sri Aurobindo made to contemporary history. Here he's writing in the 1930s, I believe he's describing fascist propaganda. A bull throat bellowed with its brazen tongue. This is in the Descent into Night. And he's describing these fascist regimes. So here it's done, in terms of sound, it's done through the same B sound, bull, bellowed, brazen. And yet, B doesn't always express this kind of thing. Each of these sounds, if one looks closely, there's a certain guna of the sound, but it has a range of possible values of what it can express. We're not talking about meanings exactly, but the kind of sense values that Sri Aurobindo was talking about. And one way of putting it that occurred to me, Sri Aurobindo sometimes in the record of yoga uses the terms chanda and saumya to make a distinction in various contexts between a fierce, literally chanda or violet, a powerful manifestation of whatever it is, and a saumya, a gentle or mild expression of the same thing. So you can have this would be the chanda form of the bee, the blows which are beating us back, the bull throat bellowing with its brazen tongue. But on the other hand, you have the saumya form expressed very beautifully here. Her body of beauty, moon, the seas of bliss. In terms of sound, this line is as far as possible from the sound of the preceding two examples that I gave, even though in all these cases we have a triple alliteration of the same sound, the B. It's because B can express different things, but still, within the various possibilities of what can be expressed in terms of beauty and bliss, there are other words for beauty and bliss, and they have slightly different. If you use charm instead of beauty, it expresses something a little bit different, and delight expresses something different than bliss. There's there are subtle differences between them. So the next letter in the alphabet is C, and here we have the cacophonous quadruple alliteration of this line with all its hard C's, in other words, the K sound, a dissonant clash of cries and contrary calls, where the hard guttural sound, which is moreover aspirated the way we pronounce it in English, gives exactly the effect that is needed here. Going on, the decisive D sound dominates this line, a delirium of delight. Here, because there are no other words in the line except two uhs and an of, it's very clear that Sri Aurobindo is making the maximum use of the possibilities of alliteration. So definitely the D means something here. And daring is the D sound. Delight, of course, is something that can be soft and gentle, but it can also be intense. And here we're talking about a delirious delight. So a delirium of delight. But D also can have, in the origins of Aryan speech, when Sri Aurobindo analyzes the D, in fact, devotes quite a bit of space to studying that particular seed sound, and he comes up with the idea that it often represents a heavy, decisive pressure, and that you see in this line, or a dull gravitation drags us down. So that's another possibility of this same guna of the D sound. Now, in contrast, the soft F sound is used to best advantage in this line. Faint, stumbling breezes faltered among flowers. And yet even the F has its fierce form, a violent, fierce and formidable world. If you say the same F sound with a greater use of the breath, it becomes a strong sound and not a soft sound. So fierce. One has to pronounce the F a little bit differently than flowers, but it's the same basic sound, and it's another possibility of the guna of F, which of course doesn't exactly exist in Sanskrit because it's not an aspirated P, pa. Then in this line we have this radiant line, this radiant effect produced by the alliteration of G's with nothing but liquid and nasal consonants almost. A glory is the golden glimmering moon. On the other hand, at the other extreme, in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo expresses all of the rasas, including here you have the Bhayanaka rasa, the terror, the mood of terror. It's not only these beautiful and exalted moods that are expressed, but in the descent into night, in the world of falsehood, you have lines like this, and horror, and the hammering heart of fear, where the H sound brings out this kind of terror, horror. But again, there's the soft H sound, and the hushed heart hears the unuttered word. That's again at the opposite range of the spectrum of the possibilities of the sound H. Now, with regard to L, in the description of the seasons at the beginning of Book 4, spring is introduced with the exuberant alliteration of L's that you have in this line. Then spring, an ardent lover, leaped through leaves. Now the effect of this line is partly due to the actual mechanics of pronouncing the letter L, because the tongue leaps from the roof of the mouth, and there's a comma before, there's a caesura there before leaped, which gives time to kind of prepare for the leap. Then spring, an ardent lover leaped through leaves, so that you can really kind of feel spring leaping through leaves here. But L also, here again, you're very conscious of the movement of the tongue in this line. All was licked up as by a lolling tongue, which is describing the intensity of the summer heat. There again, the tongue is very prominent, of course, but you can also have this very soft use of the L sound, went whispering into lakes of liquid peace. So, if I go on, I can go on like this, but I already gave this example when I was talking about M. I think because one could go on more or less indefinitely, that maybe there's no need to go on any further, and I'll now skip to the end of my presentation. And let's see. I think it's here. Okay, this I've already more or less given the substance of what Sri Aurobindo says here about his needing to make full use of all of the resources of sound. But I want to come back to the fact that I've been talking a lot about what might look like very technical aspects of poetry. But the real source of this poetry, of course, is not in technique, even though Sri Aurobindo makes such a masterful use of all the technical possibilities of English. It's inspiration, and it's a new kind of inspiration, and the new inspiration calls for a new technique. So Savitri has so far not really been appreciated much by mainstream literary people, and it may be, there are various reasons for that, but partly it may be an inability to see the new technique, to appreciate the new technique that is involved in it. But Sri Aurobindo points out, do not forget that the Savitri is an experiment in mystic poetry, spiritual poetry cast into a symbolic figure. Done on this scale, it is really a new attempt and cannot be hampered by old ideas of technique, except when they are assimilable, which of course they very often are, and he's assimilated a lot of old ideas of technique. But the attempt at mystic spiritual poetry of the kind I am at demands above all a spiritual objectivity, an intense psychophysical concreteness. That relates to more what I talked about in the other talk on Savitri and the Veda. Much of the concreteness of Sri Aurobindo's imagery can be traced back to the Veda. But it also, the role of sound also involves kind of grounding the mantra on the physical plane, the actual sounds of the words. And there too, he says, according to certain canons, there should be subtlety of art not displayed but severely concealed. Summa ars est celare artem. Very good for a certain standard of poetry, not so good or not good at all for others. Sri Aurobindo points out that Shakespeare, for example, is a good example, is an instance of a great poet who broke all the rules. And he himself was prepared to break any rules that he felt he needed to break for his purpose. And he certainly did not always severely conceal his artistry. So he concludes, I cannot bring out the spiritual objectivity if I have to be miserly about epithets, images, or deny myself the use of all available resources of sound significance. It's the last part that we've been talking about. He did not deny himself the use of all available resources of sound significance. So you have sometimes this profuse use of alliteration. There are examples I didn't give in the wide workshop of the wonderful world, or there are lots of lines that come to mind which probably would be frowned upon by a certain type of purist, either old-fashioned or modernist. But Sri Aurobindo does not restrain himself when he feels that he needs to use all the resources of the language to convey his meaning. So let me read this sentence on the mantra. I'll first just read it line by line and then very quickly just highlight some of the main points in this. It's one of the longest sentences in Savitri. I won't read the very last line, which reconnects it with the narrative. An equal greatness in her life was sown. This is the canto in which King Ashwapati speaks to his daughter, and then it changes her life in a moment, and Sri Aurobindo compares it to what the mantra can do. But I'll just read the part about the mantra, which is the whole sentence except for one line. As when the mantra sinks in yoga's ear, its message enters, stirring the blind brain, and keeps in the dim, ignorant cells its sound. The hearer understands a form of words, and musing on the index thought it holds, he strives to read it with the laboring mind, but finds bright hints, not the embodied truth. Then, falling silent in himself to know, he meets the deeper listening of his soul. The word repeats itself in rhythmic strains. Thought, vision, feeling, sense, the body's self, are seized unutterably, and he endures an ecstasy and an immortal change. He feels a wideness and becomes a power. All knowledge rushes on him like a sea. Transmuted by the white spiritual ray, he walks in naked heavens of joy and calm, sees the God face, and hears transcendent speech. So this is the effect, the possible effect of the mantra if certain conditions are satisfied, which are briefly described in this passage itself. First of all, the mantra has to be allowed to sink into the ear, preferably the inner ear. Yoga's ear is the inner listening that the Kena Upanishad talked about, shrotrasya shrotram, at least with an aspiration to hear the mantra from a deeper part of oneself. And although we normally read Savitri on the page, even if we read it silently, we have to hear it, or we're missing at least half of it. So it has to sink in. The sound of the mantra has to sink in. There are two aspects, its message and its sound, the idea and the sound, which at first they stir the brain, and we hear the sound outwardly with the outer or the at least the ignorant cells keep the sound, but so far don't understand what it signifies. The hearer understands a form of words, The form of words could be the sound, what we've been talking about, the actual physical shape of the words, and musing on the index thought it holds. So we have sound and sense. He strives to read it with the laboring mind, but finds bright hints, not the embodied truth. So clearly it's not the laboring mind, however ingenious, that can even through an analysis of the sound like what I've been doing, that kind of analysis doesn't itself lead you to an appreciation, to an experience rather, of what the mantra conveys. The conditions are described here. Then, falling silent in himself to know, he meets the deeper listening of his soul. So this falling silent in oneself is the condition, and to meet this deeper listening. So the mantra has to be received by this soul listening, and then it has the effect that is described. And some of these lines are very similar to the lines in that passage I started with. Intuitive insight, leaping into speech, seized, vibrant, kindling with the inspired word. You have the same word, seized. The word repeats itself in rhythmic strains. Thought, vision, feeling, sense, the body's self are seized unutterably, and he endures an ecstasy and an immortal change. So ideally, it's the whole being that participates in this experience of the mantra. He feels a wideness and becomes a power. All knowledge rushes on him like a sea. Transmuted by the white spiritual ray, he walks in naked heavens of joy and calm, sees the God face, and hears transcendent speech. So this ultimately is what Savitri can do for the ideal reader or hearer. It gives two things: the drishti, sees the God face, the vision, and the shruti, the hearing, the truth hearing, hears transcendent speech. So the outcomes of this are that the knowledge that rushes into us comes from these higher planes, which use these other faculties of drishti and shruti, as well as intuition. And the intuitive discrimination that Sri Aurobindo describes as the faculties of that higher consciousness. So all of those are what we come into contact with through Savitri. First of all, they were the faculties that Sri Aurobindo used in order to write Savitri, but they can also awaken in the one who makes the right use of it. And so we come back to the power of the word. It's this, one can't expect Savitri, I don't think, to miraculously change the world, and it won't even miraculously change us, except maybe momentarily. Sri Aurobindo doesn't say that the power of the word is a substitute for sadhana. It's a very valuable resource, but note what he says. The word has power. It may well have the power to awaken a spiritual impulse, an uplifting, even certain kinds of realization. Naturally, these mostly would be illuminations, not the settled and permanent realization that is the goal of yoga. But they could be steps on the way, or at least lights on the way. So we have to not exaggerate the claims that are made for Savitri. It's not that one can give up everything else and just read Savitri and expect to become a supramental being. That won't happen. One has to practice an integral path of sadhana and deal with money and all sorts of realities of this material world and do karma yoga in that context. But nevertheless, Savitri certainly can do all of the things that Sri Aurobindo says that the word can do, the mantra. So I'll stop here. I've greatly exceeded my time. So.
Thank you so much. Very, very illuminating. It's something that all of us need to study much more in depth. So, thank you so much, and we end with 1 minute of silence, and then we go for lunch.